All right, let's jump straight into this. Today, we're unpacking two of the absolute most paradigm-shifting ideas of the modern era, brought to us by the brilliant and, highly provocative thinker Nassim Nicholas Taleb. We're looking at his landmark concepts from two monumental books, The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile. Basically, by understanding the pretty grim diagnosis of the first book and the radical cure offered in the second, we're going to learn how to not just survive, but actively thrive in what is, let's face it, an increasingly chaotic world.
So think about it. How do you survive in a world you fundamentally don't understand? It's a massive, profound question, right? Because our modern, hyper-connected world, well, it feels more unpredictable than ever before. We've got access to way more data, tons of forecasting models, and more so-called experts than at any point in human history. And yet, we continually get completely blindsided by massive, world-altering events. To figure out why we're so blind, we really have to look at how we process the past. To really grasp this blindness, Taleb gives us the classic story of the Thanksgiving turkey. Imagine a turkey and it's fed every single day by a really friendly farmer. Now, every single feeding firms up the bird's belief that, hey, it's just a general rule of life to be cared for. From the turkey's perspective, analyzing all its past data, life is perfectly safe and totally predictable. The data trend is literally glowing, right up until, well, the Wednesday afternoon before Thanksgiving. And this just brilliantly illustrates the illusion of predictability. The turkey's past data was absolutely useless for predicting its future risk.
Okay. Let's look at the roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover the illusion of predictability, beware the black swan, the antidote to chaos, the triad of survival, the barbell strategy, and finally, thriving in the unknown.
Starting with Section 1, the illusion of predictability, and why the turkey is always surprised. The short answer here is what we call the narrative fallacy. See, we humans, we absolutely love neat, tidy stories way more than messy, chaotic realities. We tend to look backward and weave this nice thread of logic into history, falsely believing we can predict what comes next. But our environment has fundamentally changed, which basically renders those predictions completely useless.
Taleb divides the world into two very different domains. First up is Mediocristan. In Mediocristan, things are subject to physical constraints and mild randomness. Think about human height. If you measure 1,000 people, finding one exceptionally tall person isn't going to drastically change the overall average, right? But modernity and global interconnectedness have completely pushed us into the second domain, Extremistan. This is the place of wild randomness. It's totally unpredictable, winner-take-all, and has absolutely zero physical constraints. Think about things like wealth, book sales, or internet traffic. A single event, or just one individual, can literally dominate the entire total. So in Extremistan, the average means absolutely nothing, and the extremes dictate everything.
Which brings us to Section 2, beware the black swan, the threat of the highly improbable. Our shift away from the ancestral world of Mediocristan into this highly complex, artificial world is exactly what exposes us to massive, unseen threats. This is really the central thesis of Taleb's diagnosis. Enter the black swan. And no, we are not talking about the actual bird here. A black swan is an event with three very distinct attributes. First, it's a massive outlier, meaning it lies way outside the realm of regular expectations, completely unpredicted. Second, it carries an extreme impact. And third, and honestly, this is the most crucial part, human nature makes us concoct explanations for it after the fact. We trick ourselves into thinking it was predictable all along. We try to retroactively model it, completely missing the whole point that, by its very nature, it was unpredictable. Just consider history for a second. The Great War, the rise of extreme regimes, the sudden spread of the internet, the 1987 market crash, September 11th. None of these were predicted by the consensus of experts before they actually happened. Yet these singular, highly improbable events completely shape the trajectory of the world we live in right now. Life is essentially just the cumulative effect of a handful of significant shocks. We spend all our time studying the ordinary, when our reality is actually driven by the highly extraordinary.
Moving to Section 3, the antidote to chaos, moving beyond mere resilience. Now, this is exactly where we bridge Taleb's two masterpieces. If the black swan is the grim diagnosis, that we live in a world dominated by unpredictable, massive shocks that our models simply cannot foresee, well, anti-fragile is the cure. Because if we can't predict these massive black swans, what on earth can we do to survive them? We need a completely new property, something that goes way, way beyond just being resilient.
I absolutely love this quote right here. I'd rather be dumb and anti-fragile than extremely smart and fragile. Taleb wrote his follow-up book precisely as the prescriptive conclusion to the whole black swan problem. And the thesis?
It's beautifully simple and honestly a little rebellious. It basically says, since you cannot predict the black swan, you shouldn't even try. Instead, you need to build systems and a life that actually benefit from the shock of the unknown.
So, here is the definition of anti-fragility. It is the exact, literal opposite of fragility. Make sure you really get this distinction, because it goes way beyond just bouncing back or being robust. A robust system simply withstands a shock and stays exactly the same. But an anti-fragile system, it actually gets better from chaos, volatility, and disorder. It's like your muscles growing stronger from the micro tears of resistance training, or your immune system adapting after fighting an infection. The anti-fragile actively loves and quite literally needs disorder to survive.
Section 4. The triad of survival. Fragile, robust, anti-fragile. Taleb uses this brilliant framework to classify absolutely everything in the known world, from human bodies and psychological states all the way to financial markets and urban planning. Everything falls somewhere on this triad. To really grasp these three states, Taleb uses some super vivid mythological metaphors. So on the left, we have the fragile. Think of the sword of Damocles, dangling by a single horsehair. Any tiny vibration, any stress at all, and it falls and destroys what's beneath it. It absolutely hates volatility. Then, in the middle, we have the robust, represented by the phoenix. It turns to ash and is reborn exactly the same as before. It endures, sure, but it doesn't improve. And finally, on the right, the anti-fragile, the mighty hydra. You cut off one head, and two more grow back in its place. The hydra doesn't just survive the sword, it literally uses the damage to multiply its strength. And obviously, our goal is to be the hydra.
All right, Section 5, the barbell strategy and how to actually harness positive black swans. So how do we practically do this? Well, we know we live in Extremistan. We know black swans are coming. But remember, black swans can be positive too. Like a serendipitous, massive career break or an exponential technological leap. We can actually design our lives, our portfolios, and our businesses to literally harness those positive black swans while completely neutralizing the negative ones. Here is the barbell strategy broken down. It basically requires playing at the absolute extremes. Step 1, you put 85 to 90% of your resources, whether that's money, time, or energy, into hyper-conservative, ultra-safe bets. This establishes a rock-solid floor and totally protects you from the risk of ruin. Step 2, you put the remaining 10 to 15% into hyper-aggressive, speculative bets. And I really have to explicitly warn you here. The conventional, moderate middle, or medium risk approach, it is actually a sucker's game. It is totally full of hidden risks and measurement errors where a negative black swan can wipe you out completely. You absolutely must avoid the middle.
Just think of it like this visual. 90% maximum safety, 10% maximum speculation. By clipping your downside entirely with that safe portion, no catastrophic event can destroy you. You're safe. But that 10% on the speculative edge, that gives you exposure to massive, open-ended upside. If your speculative bet fails, well, you lose very little. But if a positive black swan hits that 10%, the payoff is absolutely astronomical. It's basically the perfect marriage of extreme paranoia and extreme aggressiveness. Finally, Section 6, Thriving in the Unknown through Via Negativity and Optionality. Let's look at how we can implement these concepts day to day to become completely non-predictive. Because remember, if you're spending your time trying to forecast the future, you are acting exactly like the turkey.
A core tactic of being anti-fragile is via negativa, which is basically improvement by subtraction. We usually think that to get better, we need to add things, right? More features, more models, more complexity, more medication. But think about ancient medicine for a second. Patients often got better simply when doctors stopped bleeding them with leeches. Removing hidden risks, removing bad debt, removing toxic relationships are just stripping away overcomplicated predictive models that give us a false sense of security. Mathematically, that is so much more effective than trying to bolt on supposedly robust features.
So it all boils down to this. There is just one simple rule when dealing with the unknown. Always seek optionality. This means positioning yourself to have asymmetric payoffs, basically ensuring you have way more upside than downside from random events. That is the true test of anti-fragility. If a shock, a mistake, or some random bit of volatility has a strictly capped downside, but a theoretically unlimited upside, boom, you are in an anti-fragile position. You no longer need to stress about predicting the future. You just need to position yourself to catch the positive shockwaves when they inevitably happen.
I want to leave you with this provocative question to chew on. Take a look at your career, your investments, your daily habits. Are you building a life that merely survives a disorder, like the Phoenix, or are you building one that actually thrives because of it, like the Hydra? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today. The black swans are coming, for sure, so go out there and build your anti-fragility.
So I want you to imagine waking up on just a crisp, beautiful morning. You stretch, you look around, and everything in your environment is perfectly designed for your comfort. You are a turkey.
A turkey.
Yeah, a turkey.
Right.
And you're born into this enclosure, and almost immediately, you noticed a pattern. Every single day, a human comes out to the yard. And you might be a little skittish at first because, well, humans are large, they make loud noises, they just seem kind of chaotic.
Oh, for sure.
But this human doesn't hurt you. In fact, they bring you premium, nutrient-rich corn.
Right, and they ensure the water trough is completely full. They fix the fence to keep the foxes out.
Exactly. Day 2 arrives, the human comes back, more corn.
Right.
Day 50, same exact thing. By day 100, you're starting to form a worldview. I mean, you're a rational creature looking at the data available to you.
You're running the numbers.
You are running the numbers. By day 500, you have a flawless statistical track record. You have hundreds of data points, just a perfectly straight line on a graph, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that humans are fundamentally benevolent creatures.
Yeah, their sole purpose in the universe is to care for your every need.
Right. Every single day that passes reinforces this theory. Life is perfectly secure. And then, well, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving arrives.
Oh, man. The butcher walks out, and he isn't carrying corn.
No, he is not. In one brutal fraction of a second, your entire paradigm is shattered. A worldview built on 1,000 days of impeccable, flawless data is just violently overturned.
It's completely destroyed.
And what was a complete unimaginable shock to you, like a violation of the very laws of physics as you understood them, was entirely planned and orchestrated by the butcher. To you, it is a catastrophic surprise. To the butcher, it's just Wednesday.
Yeah, it is a devastating failure of inductive reasoning. I mean, the turkey looked at the past, assumed the past was just a perfect map of the future, and walked right into the slaughterhouse feeling perfectly safe.
Wow. Yeah.
The data wasn't just incomplete, It was actively misleading. The prolonged period of safety is exactly what created the ultimate vulnerability.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah.
And we're going to spend this entire deep dive figuring out how you, listening right now, can avoid being the turkey.
Highly recommended.
We are exploring the foundational concepts from 2 just monumental books by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile. They're part of his broader Incertos series.
Right.
We're looking at the invisible, totally unpredictable shocks that upend our lives, our markets, and our societies. But more importantly, we're looking at how we can restructure the way we live so that those shocks don't destroy us. So I have to ask you, the listener, is your life, your career, your business built like a fragile porcelain teacup, or is it built like a muscle? Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to even begin restructuring or, building that muscle, we really have to look at the invisible forces that are constantly stressing our systems.
The thing's trying to break the teacup.
Exactly. Because you can't design a better architecture until you truly grasp the nature of the earthquake. And the earthquake in this framework is what the author terms the black swan.
And I want to spend some time on that term because I feel like I hear it everywhere now.
Oh, absolutely everywhere.
Right. You turn on a financial news channel and some pundit is blaming like a minor dip in tech stocks on a black swan. It feels like it has just become a catch-all excuse for any bad day at the office.
Yeah.
But the source material is incredibly specific about what actually qualifies, isn't it?
It is. The dilution of the term is actually a major issue the text points out. A true black swan event rests on 3 distinct pillars.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, it is an absolute outlier. It lies completely outside the realm of regular expectations. Like literally nothing in the historical data points to its possibility.
The turkey's Wednesday.
Exactly. The turkey's Wednesday. Second, it carries a massive landscape-altering impact. We aren't talking about a rough fiscal quarter here. We're talking about the complete restructuring of an industry, a society, or, a geopolitical order.
Got it. Okay, so it's a total surprise and it changes everything. What's the third pillar?
The third is the most fascinating, I think, and it has to do with human psychology. Despite the event being an unprecedented outlier, human nature forces us to concoct explanations for its occurrence after the fact.
Oh, right.
We look backward and tell ourselves a story that makes the event seem completely explainable and predictable, even though literally nobody saw it coming.
The sources call that the narrative fallacy.
Yeah.
Our brains just seem to have this desperate need to impose order on a chaotic universe.
We can't handle the randomness.
We really can't. I was thinking about the examples given in the text, the rise of the internet, the 9/11 attacks, the 2008 financial crash.
Classic black swans.
Yeah. And if you read the news the day after any of those events, the landscape was just flooded with people saying, oh, obviously the housing market was going to collapse. The subprime data was right there.
Right. Everyone's a genius in hindsight.
Exactly. But the day before the crash, those exact same experts were either entirely silent or, even worse, actively buying those very mortgages.
Yeah, retrospective distortion is just incredibly powerful. The human brain is a very energy-intensive organ, and storing thousands of random, disconnected facts is exhausting. So we compress reality.
You make a story out of it.
We weave complex, chaotic realities into neat, logical storylines. Because a story with a beginning, middle, and end is easy to remember. But the danger is that this neatness tricks us into believing we actually understand the mechanics of the world.
We confuse looking backward with looking forward.
Precisely. We confuse our ability to summarize the past with the ability to predict the future.
Which makes us so vulnerable, because we start building systems based on those neat fictional stories. And if the story is flawed, well, the system is going to crack when the real world asserts itself.
It's guaranteed to crack.
And this brings up another concept from the text that I just found mind-bending. The author divides the world into two different domains of randomness, calling them Mediocristan and Extremistan.
Yes!
And I need help visualizing these because they sound like fictional places, but they actually describe the invisible rules governing everything we do, don't they?
They do. Think of them as two completely different sets of physical laws. Mediocristan is the domain of mild randomness. It is governed by physical constraints and biological limits.
Okay, like what?
The classic illustration the text uses is human height or weight. Imagine you gather 1,000 randomly selected adults in a large stadium.
Okay, I'm picturing a stadium.
And you calculate their average weight. Now you introduce the heaviest human being on the entire planet into that stadium. What happens to the overall average?
Well, I mean, it wouldn't budge much. The heaviest person might weigh 3 or 4 times the average, maybe even 5 times. But distributed across 1,000 people, their individual impact on the total is just microscopic.
Exactly. In Mediocristan, no single observation can meaningfully impact the aggregate. The past is a very reliable indicator of the future there. You can use standard bell curve statistics to make predictions.
Because physical laws keep things in check.
Right. If you know the average height of a population, you aren't going to suddenly encounter a human who is 3 miles tall. Physical laws prevent extreme outliers.
So that's the world our intuition is built for, the natural world.
Yeah.
But then there is Extremistan, and this is where physical constraints just kind of vanish, right?
Extremistan is defined by wild randomness. Let's use that exact same stadium experiment. You have the same 1,000 people, but this time you calculate their average net worth.
Oh boy.
Yeah. And then you invite a multi-billionaire like Bill Gates or Elon Musk to walk into the room.
The average completely explodes. Suddenly, statistically speaking, everyone in the stadium is a multimillionaire.
That one single person represents 99.9% of the total wealth in the room. The other 1,000 people, representing the bulk of the population, are reduced to a rounding error.
That is wild randomness.
In Extremistan, inequalities are so vast that a single observation, a single black swan, can dwarf everything else combined. Book sales, Spotify streams, financial markets, the spread of a virus in a globally connected world, these all live in Extremistan.
Right, because you have millions of authors selling a dozen copies of their novel, and then J.K. Rowling sells hundreds of millions.
Exactly. There's no physical limit on how many books can be sold, unlike how tall a person can grow.
And the terrifying implication here is that modern life, with the internet, global supply chains, hyperconnectivity, has completely migrated into Extremistan. The constraints of geography and physical scale are just gone.
They're completely gone.
But we are still navigating this new world. using maps drawn from Mediocristan.
Yeah.
Like we use bell curves to predict the stock market.
Which is mathematically absurd. Using standard deviation to manage financial risk is like trying to measure the distance to the moon with a desktop thermometer.
That is a great way to put it.
You are applying the mathematics of mild randomness to a system governed by wild randomness. And this delusion, the belief that risk can be quantified in complex extremistan systems, is what fragilizes our society.
So if we are living in a domain where extreme shocks are basically guaranteed to happen, and we are fundamentally incapable of predicting when they will happen or how big they'll be, what is the alternative? Like, how do we actually survive?
Well, this is where the concept of antifragile comes in. The text lays out this triad, these three distinct ways that things react to stress.
Okay, break the triad down for us.
The triad is really the core framework for surviving extremistan. To explain the three states of being, the author uses mythological analogies. The first state is the fragile.
The porcelain teacup.
Right. And mythologically, this is represented by the sword of Damocles.
Oh, I might know this one.
Yeah, Damocles was a courtier allowed to sit on the king's throne, but the king suspended a massive razor sharp sword directly over his head, held by a single hair from a horse's tail.
Talk about pure anxiety. You are sitting there with everything to lose and absolutely no potential upside. A tiny shift in the room's temperature, a slight breeze, or just the natural degradation of the horsehair over time, and the sword falls. You are destroyed.
Exactly. The fragile system requires absolute peace and tranquility just to survive. Any volatility breaks it.
Okay, so that's fragile. What's the second state?
The second state in the triad is the robust or the resilient. The mythology here is the phoenix.
Right, the bird that catches fire.
The phoenix dies in a magnificent fire and is reborn from its own ashes. It takes the ultimate shock, death, and immolation and returns exactly as it was.
It survives the shock, but, it doesn't evolve. It doesn't become a fireproof bird the next time around. It just resets to its baseline.
That's the key. Robustness is highly desirable in certain structures, obviously, like a bridge. You want a bridge to be robust against a hurricane. But robustness is fundamentally static. It doesn't improve.
Which leads to the third state.
Yes. A property so deeply misunderstood that the author literally had to invent a new word for it. Anti-fragility. The mythological counterpart here is the Hydra, the multi-headed serpent.
From Hercules.
Right. When Hercules cuts off one of its heads, two new heads grow back in its place.
Wow. So the Hydra actually desires the stressor. It needs the damage to increase its complexity and strength. If you leave the Hydra alone, it just stays the same. If you attack it, it gets stronger. It actually gains from disorder.
This is the fundamental property behind all complex living systems. Evolution, immune systems, innovation, bacterial resistance, they are all anti-fragile. They use volatility, stress, and disorder as fuel for growth.
And this is driven by a biological phenomenon mentioned in the sources, right? Called hormesis.
Yes, hormesis.
I was reading about hormesis in the notes, and it immediately made me think of lifting weights.
It's the perfect example.
Because when you go to the gym and lift something heavy, you aren't actually building muscle in that moment. You are causing microscopic tears in your muscle fibers.
Right.
You are literally injuring your body.
You're applying a stressor.
Right. But your body responds to that minor trauma by overcompensating. It rebuilds the tissue, denser and stronger, so that the next time you face that exact same load, it isn't a threat. The poison, in a small dose, is actually the cure.
To a biological system, a stressor isn't just physical damage, it is a vital packet of information. The stressor communicates with the organism saying, hey, the environment requires this level of capacity, you need to upgrade immediately. When you remove all stressors, you literally cut off that flow of information.
Oh, that completely explains the example of spending a month in bed. You could be perfectly comfortable, perfectly safe, totally removed from any risk of injury, but without gravity, without friction, without the microstressors of walking and moving, your muscles atrophy. Your bones lose density.
The safety becomes the danger.
Exactly. By trying to protect the system from all harm, you actively weaken it. You turn a robust human body into a fragile teacup.
And the implications for how we run our society are massive here. We try to engineer all the friction out of our lives. We have top-down economic policies aiming to smooth out every minor recession. We have helicopter parents removing every social conflict from their children's lives.
We just view volatility as a disease to be cured, rather than the essential information complex systems need to survive.
We do.
And that perfectly sets up this concept that just blew my mind from the reading. Lecturing birds on how to fly. The sources refer to this as the Soviet Harvard illusion.
Ah, yes.
I always assumed that academic breakthroughs drove human progress. Like someone writes a brilliant theory in a lab, and then the engineers build it. How is that an
Yeah.
illusion?
Well, you are describing the Baconian linear model of knowledge. It is the widespread belief that formal theoretical knowledge is the parent of practical application. The illusion is the belief that academics write the equations of aerodynamics and then they teach the birds how to fly.
But the birds fly perfectly well without knowing a single equation of physics.
Exactly. The reality of human progress is deeply anti-fragile. Progress is actually driven by tinkerers, mechanics, and risk-takers, people who get their hands dirty.
The ones on the ground.
Yeah. They rely on trial and error, taking small, manageable risks, failing repeatedly, and letting the environment tell them what works. They embrace the disorder of the real world.
And the academics come later.
Right. Only later, after the technology already exists, do the academics come in, observe the phenomenon, write down the formalized mathematical models, and then write history books claiming the theory drove the invention.
It's the narrative fallacy applied to the history of innovation.
Exactly.
The people taking the risks and facing the volatility are actually driving the progress. But the people sitting in the ivory towers get all the credit because they write the history. The tinkering process works precisely because it is anti-fragile. I mean, every small failure provides information that improves the next iteration.
And the academic model is inherently fragile. It relies on finding the perfect theory before acting. If the theory is fundamentally flawed, which in extremistan it almost certainly is, the entire project collapses. The tinkerer doesn't need a perfect theory, they just need a system that survives failure and captures the upside.
Wow. Okay, let's pull back for a second. So we have these two massive frameworks. We have the black swan, the unpredictable landscape-altering shocks of extremistan, and we have anti-fragility, systems that gain from disorder and stress. Seeing these side by side, it really feels like the sources are essentially presenting a diagnosis and a cure. Here's where it gets really interesting.
What's fascinating here is that the deepest synthesis of the source material is exactly that. Anti-fragile is the practical blueprint for navigating a black swan world. They both share a deep, deep skepticism of what the author calls the fragilistas.
The fragilistas, I love that term. Who exactly are they?
They are the modern experts, the economists, the risk managers, the corporate strategists who build incredibly complex, mathematically elegant models that are just entirely divorced from reality.
Right. They optimize global supply chains to be perfectly efficient, removing all redundancy to save a few pennies. But in doing so, they ensure that a single blocked canal or a single factory fire causes a cascading global shortage.
They're the ones causing systemic harm because they convince everyone that risk is under control. They are the butcher showing the turkey the beautifully formatted Excel spreadsheet, proving that Thanksgiving doesn't exist.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it. The fragilistas rely on the illusion of prediction, and the monumental paradigm shift offered by these books is moving away from prediction entirely and moving toward the measurement of exposure.
Okay, explain that distinction to me. Moving from predicting risk to measuring exposure, why is that so crucial?
Well, it comes down to basic mathematics and observable reality. Risk, particularly in extremistan, just cannot be calculated. It is impossible to predict the exact date, severity, and mechanism of the next market crash or technological disruption. However, fragility is completely observable and measurable right now, independent of any future event. I think an analogy might help here. Let's say I live in California, right on a major fault line. The fragilista approach would be to hire a team of the world's best seismologists, give them supercomputers, and tell them to predict the exact date and Richter scale magnitude of the next major earthquake.
And they might spend billions of dollars on this model.
Right, but because tectonic plates are a highly complex system, their prediction will almost certainly be wrong. They are trying to predict the black swan.
And while they are obsessing over the prediction, the city remains completely vulnerable.
Exactly. The anti-fragile approach ignores the prediction entirely. You accept that an earthquake is inevitable, even if you don't know when. Instead of looking at the fault line, you look at your house.
Yes.
Are the walls made of rigid, brittle stone? Or are they made of flexible, shock-absorbing materials? Are the bookshelves bolted to the wall? You don't need to predict the event. You just need to ensure that the structure you live in can absorb a shock and remain standing. You focus on your exposure.
That structural analysis is the death of standard risk management. You stop worrying about probabilities and you start focusing entirely on asymmetries. You clip your downside so that you are immune to ruin, and you structure your affairs so that volatility actually benefits you.
So what does this all mean? Like, how do we actually do this? If I accept that my life is governed by wild randomness and I want to stop relying on fragile predictions, what is the blueprint? How do I build that flexible house in my finances, my career, my daily habits?
Well, the notes outline several specific strategies. Let's explore the barbell strategy first.
The barbell strategy.
The barbell strategy directly attacks conventional wisdom. Most financial or career advice tells you to seek out the golden mean, the moderate medium risk path.
Like a diversified portfolio of medium yield bonds.
Exactly, or the stable middle management career.
But the sources argue the middle is a trap, don't they?
The middle is exactly where hidden tail risks reside. You think you are safe because the daily volatility is low, but you are actually exposed to a catastrophic black swan that can wipe you out completely.
Because it's extremistan.
Right. So think of a physical weightlifting barbell. It has heavy weights loaded on the two extreme ends with absolutely nothing in the middle. The strategy is to combine extreme paranoia and safety on one end with extreme speculation and risk-taking on the other.
Okay, so in a financial context, instead of putting all my savings into a medium-risk mutual fund, which could suddenly lose half its value in a 2008-style crash, I would take 90% of my money and put it into the safest possible vehicles.
Short-term treasury bills, cash under the mattress.
Right, things that won't make me rich, but are guaranteed never to go to zero.
That 90% represents the paranoia. You have completely eliminated the risk of ruin. No matter what the stock market does, your survival is guaranteed, the downside is capped.
And then the remaining 10% is where I get aggressive. I take that small portion and I put it into hyper-speculative ventures. Angel investing in tech startups, highly volatile assets, out-of-the-money options.
Things where the money could very easily disappear completely.
Yeah, but if it hits, it could return 1,000% or more.
You are systematically exposing yourself to positive black swans. If the 10% goes to zero, the impact on your life is negligible. You still have your 90%. You survived the stressor.
Wow.
But if that 10% hits, it transforms your entire financial reality. The asymmetry is massive, your maximum loss is strictly known and manageable, but your potential upside is infinite.
And this doesn't just apply to money either. You can barbell your career. You don't take a job at a mid-sized corporation where you could be laid off unexpectedly after 10 years. You get a completely secure, perhaps boring 9-to-5 job that pays the rent and provides health insurance. That's your safe 90%.
Yes.
Then from 7 p.m. to midnight, you write a wild, experimental screenplay, or you start a controversial podcast, or you try to invent a new software app. You embrace extreme, high upside risk in your free time, underwritten by the total security of your day job.
The barbell creates anti-fragility because the stable end absorbs the shocks of life, while the speculative end feasts on the volatility of extremistan. You no longer fear disorder, you are actually hunting for it with a portion of your resources.
That idea of restructuring things leads perfectly into another major concept from the notes: via negativa, or addition by subtraction. It seems like our default mode as a society is to constantly add things to fix problems.
That interventionist instinct is deeply ingrained in us. We assume more data, more software, more medicine, more laws will solve our complexities. But the premise of via negativa is that human beings are fundamentally better at knowing what is wrong than knowing what is right.
We can spot the bad easier than we can invent the good.
Exactly. Our knowledge is much more robust when we subtract.
The text uses a term here that I actually had to look up: iatrogenics.
Yes, iatrogenics refers to harm caused by the healer. Historically, if you went to a doctor in the 18th century with a fever, they wouldn't just let your immune system, an incredibly ancient anti-fragile system, do its work. They felt compelled to intervene.
They had to do something.
Right, so they would bleed you or give you mercury. The intervention itself was often the cause of death.
They couldn't stand the idea of doing nothing, so they added a solution that ultimately killed the patient.
In complex systems, whether it is a human body, an ecosystem, or an economy, adding a new variable almost always introduces unintended consequences and hidden fragilities. Via negativa argues that the safest, most robust way to improve a system is to remove the elements that are fragile or harmful.
It's so much more practical, too. Think about health. If someone wants to get healthier, the modern instinct is to add things. Start a complex new supplement routine, buy an expensive bio-tracking ring, subscribe to a new fitness app.
Oh, definitely.
But the via negativa approach would be to simply stop drinking sugary sodas and stop eating ultra-processed foods. Removing the negative is incredibly potent and carries almost zero risk of unintended side effects.
The exact same applies to corporate management. When productivity drops, management's instinct is to buy a new project management software and force the entire company into a multi-day training seminar.
Which everyone hates.
Right. The anti-fragile solution is to look at the calendar and permanently cancel the daily 1-hour status meeting that drains everyone's energy. Removing the noise allows the system's natural capacity to emerge.
I want to pivot to something the author seems incredibly passionate about. The tone of the books really shifts when discussing this next takeaway. Skin in the game. It isn't just presented as a financial strategy, it is presented as a fundamental moral law of the universe.
The absence of skin in the game is perhaps the greatest source of fragility in the modern world. It goes back to the core mechanism of learning in complex systems. If a system doesn't experience the negative consequences of its actions, it cannot learn, it cannot adapt.
Right.
Skin in the game means that you cannot possess the right to a potential upside without also bearing the financial or professional risk of the downside.
The text references Hammurabi's code from ancient Babylon to illustrate this. I looked it up, and it is brutally elegant.
It really is.
The code stated that if a builder constructs a house for a man and the house collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death.
That is perfect alignment of incentives. The builder is not going to cut corners on the foundation to save a few coins. His own survival is inextricably linked to the robustness of his creation. The risk is completely internalized.
Now compare that ancient wisdom to the architects of the 2008 financial crisis. You had bankers and risk managers making highly speculative bets with other people's money. When the housing market was booming, they collected tens of millions of dollars in personal bonuses. They captured all the upside.
Every penny of it.
But when the black swan hit and the extremist hand mathematics collapsed the system, those bankers didn't lose their homes. They didn't lose their savings. The government used taxpayer money to bail out the institutions.
The bankers externalized the downside to the public while internalizing the upside for themselves. The system failed to learn from the shock because the individuals who caused it felt literally no pain. They were shielded from the volatility.
Which makes them dangerous.
Extremely. The primary heuristic the author derives from this is absolute. Never trust advice, a prediction, or a policy from someone who doesn't pay a price if they are wrong.
So, if a geopolitical pundit goes on television and forcefully advocates for a military intervention, but they don't have a child in the military, and their career won't suffer if the war becomes a disaster, their opinion should be treated as dangerous noise. They are an empty suit.
Exactly. And the concept extends into how we navigate uncertainty through optionality.
Okay? How does skin in the game relate to optionality?
Well, when you have skin in the game, you want to structure your risks so that you survive the downsides. An option is the mathematical embodiment of that survival. It gives you the right, but never the obligation to take an action.
Right.
When you possess optionality, you don't need to be able to predict the future. You just need the baseline rationality to recognize a favorable outcome when it presents itself, and the ability to ignore the unfavorable ones.
The sources tell this amazing story about Thales of Miletus, an ancient Greek philosopher. People were mocking him, saying that if his philosophy was so great, why was he so poor? So one winter, Thales used the little bit of money he had to put a deposit down on the use of all the olive presses in his region for the upcoming harvest.
He didn't buy the presses, right?
No, he didn't buy the presses. He bought the option to rent them at a fixed price.
Thales couldn't predict the weather. He didn't know if the harvest would be good or bad, but he structured a deeply asymmetric bet. If the harvest was terrible, his downside was strictly capped. He simply lost his small initial deposit.
But the harvest turned out to be historically massive. Suddenly, every farmer in the region desperately needed an olive press at the exact same time. Thales held the rights to all of them, and he rented them out at a massive premium, making an absolute fortune.
He exposed himself to a massive positive black swan while strictly limiting his risk.
You can practice optionality in your daily life too. The rational flaneur is a great example from the text. Like, a tourist plans an incredibly rigid itinerary for a trip to Paris. Every single hour is mapped out. That schedule is fragile. A single delayed train or unexpected rainstorm ruins the entire day.
It shatters the teacup.
Exactly. The flaneur, however, wanders the city with a general direction, but no fixed schedule. They are completely open to serendipity. If they hear music down an alleyway, they have the option to follow it. They are positioned to capture the upside of the unexpected.
Going to a cocktail party when you're slightly tired is optionality. The worst-case scenario is capped. You stay for 45 minutes, get bored, and go home to sleep. But the upside is theoretically infinite. You might bump into someone who becomes a massive client, or you might meet your future spouse. You are placing yourself in the path of positive volatility.
That's such a good way to look at it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, everything we've discussed so far, the barbell, via negativa, skin in the game, optionality, these are tools for conquering extremistan.
It sounds like a superpower. You clip your downside, you welcome the stressors, you let the chaos make you stronger. But I have to pause here because we really need to engage in some critical thinking about all this.
Let's do it.
Because if we take this philosophy at face value, it sounds like we should just constantly seek out chaos.
Yeah.
Is all stress actually good? Can this framework fail?
It's vital that we don't romanticize anti-fragility. It has strict mathematical boundaries. The most glaring blind spot, or perhaps the most frequent misapplication of the theory, involves what we might call the threshold of ruin.
Right, because hormesis, the idea that the dose makes the poison, implies there is a limit.
There is a deeply nonlinear response to stress. We established that lifting a heavy weight causes micro tears in the muscle, which the body repairs to become stronger. The stressor is beneficial.
Yes.
But if a crane drops a 3-ton steel beam on your chest, your body doesn't overcompensate and turn you into a superhero. You are crushed. The stressor completely bypassed your capacity for adaptation and caused irreversible destruction.
There is a point of no return.
The technical term is path dependence. The order of events matters immensely. A system cannot learn from a shock if the shock terminates the system. You cannot benefit from the volatility of a market crash if the crash completely bankrupts you and takes away your ability to invest at the new, lower prices.
That makes total sense.
Anti-fragility is entirely predicated on surviving the initial stressor.
So if someone misinterprets this book and says, well, volatility is good, so I'm going to leverage my entire net worth into a highly volatile crypto asset to expose myself to disorder, they aren't being anti-fragile. They are being reckless.
Very reckless.
If they haven't established the safe, paranoid end of their barbell first, they are just a fragile system begging to be broken.
Exactly. The system must survive to learn. Which brings us to an even darker implication of the theory: the sacrifice of the individual components for the sake of the collective.
This was the part of the text that really gave me pause. The author explicitly states that the anti-fragility of a macro system often relies entirely on the extreme fragility of its microparts.
Let's examine the restaurant industry in a highly competitive city like New York or Tokyo. The restaurant scene as a whole is incredibly anti-fragile. It is constantly evolving, constantly elevating its culinary standards, adapting to new dietary trends and economic conditions. It thrives on the chaos of the market.
But why does it improve?
It improves because individual restaurants are going bankrupt every single week. The macro system learns and adapts through the localized death of the individual components. The capital, the chefs, the real estate, it all gets reallocated from the failed experiments to the successful ones.
And the exact same dynamic drives the technology sector. Silicon Valley is an engine of anti-fragile innovation, precisely because the vast majority of startups fail completely.
Evolution itself operates on this ruthless calculus. A species becomes stronger over millennia because the individuals who lack the necessary adaptations die before they can pass on their genes. The collective thrives on the sacrifice of the fragile units.
And that leads to a deeply uncomfortable question for us. I mean, it is wonderful to talk about how capitalism learns from failure or how evolution builds robust species. But what if you are the restaurant owner who just lost their entire life savings?
Right.
What if you are the founder whose startup goes to zero? Can we casually embrace a philosophy where individual ruin is just brushed off as the necessary tuition for collective progress?
It is a stark, cold reality. The author does suggest that society should honor failed entrepreneurs the same way we honor fallen soldiers, because they took the risks that drive our collective progress. But that philosophical reframing doesn't pay the rent for the person facing bankruptcy.
It really doesn't.
It highlights a scale problem. Anti-fragility is beautiful at the systemic level, but at the individual level, life remains precarious.
I think that tension brings up another major point of critique, which is the messenger himself. Reading these books, you cannot ignore the tone. The author doesn't just disagree with mainstream economists, he actively insults them. He calls people idiots, empty suits, and fragilistas. He is intensely combative. Does that approach undermine his own message?
This raises an important question about presentation versus substance. The tone is certainly a filter. By aggressively attacking the academic and financial establishments, he gives them an easy excuse to dismiss him. They can focus on his lack of decorum rather than engaging with the complex mathematics of fat tails and extreme risk.
Right, the abrasive delivery can obscure the brilliance of the underlying theory. But is there a strategic reason for it?
Undoubtedly. Information, as the text notes, is anti-fragile. Controversy sells books and spreads ideas. By picking fights, he ensures his concepts are debated. But more deeply, his refusal to be polite to people he believes are causing systemic harm is a demonstration of his own principles.
Oh, interesting.
He isn't playing the career-safe game of academic politeness. He is putting his own reputation on the line, which is a form of skin in the game.
He certainly practices what he preaches when it comes to volatility. As we draw these massive concepts together, I want to look at one final heuristic from the end of the notes that feels like, well, a grounding mechanism for all this chaos. It's called the Lindy effect.
Ah, Lindy.
I saw this term, and it seemed to be related to how time tests systems. What exactly is Lindy?
The Lindy effect is a powerful mental model for navigating extremistan and determining what is truly robust. It fundamentally changes how we view the lifespan of things. For perishable items like a carton of milk or a human being, every day that passes brings it statistically closer to its end. A 90-year-old human has fewer days left than a 20-year-old.
That's our intuitive understanding of aging. The math is linear and downward.
But for non-perishable things, ideas, technologies, books, religions, the math actually reverses. If a non-perishable item has survived for a long time, its life expectancy actually increases with every passing day.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So if a classic book has been in print and widely read for 50 years, the Lindy effect suggests we can confidently expect it to remain relevant for another 50 years.
Exactly. If an idea like Stoicism or the concept of skin in the game has survived for over 2,000 years, it has proven its anti-fragility. It has survived wars, paradigm shifts, technological revolutions, and cultural upheavals. The fact that it is still here means it is incredibly robust.
Because time is the ultimate stress tester.
Time is the ultimate black swan generator. The Lindy effect serves as a massive warning against what the author calls neomania, our modern obsession with the new. We constantly assume that the newest technology, the newest dietary trend, or the newest management theory is inherently superior.
But the new is completely unproven. It hasn't faced a single black swan.
Precisely. It hasn't been subjected to the volatility of extremistan yet. The heuristics advocated in these books, avoiding debt, having skin in the game, relying on trial and error, prioritizing subtraction over addition, these are ancient. They are deeply Lindy. They have survived because they work in a world we don't fully understand.
Which brings us to the ultimate shift in worldview that this deep dive demands. When you look around at modernity, the algorithms attempting to predict our behavior, the optimized supply chains, the central bank interventions, the hyper-scheduling of our lives, it is all part of a relentless, systemic campaign to eliminate randomness.
We are trying to pave over the wilderness of human existence. We want our lives to be smooth, perfectly predictable, and entirely comfortable. We're trying to force the world into mediocristan.
But the world is extremistan. And by engineering out all the small daily frictions, by suppressing the minor volatilities, we aren't actually eliminating risk. We are just hiding it.
We're accumulating massive, invisible tail risks.
We are systematically turning our bodies, our economies, and our institutions into highly optimized, beautifully fragile porcelain teacups, resting right on the edge of the table, completely blind to the fact that we live in an earthquake zone.
We are fragilizing ourselves with the illusion of control, which leaves us with the central poetic distillation of the entire philosophy, drawn from the prologue of the source material. Wind extinguishes a candle and energizes fire.
The candle is the fragile system. The wind is the volatility, the unexpected stressor, the black swan. The fragile candle is destroyed by the wind. It needs absolute stillness to survive. But the fire is anti-fragile. The fire craves the wind. The wind feeds it, makes it grow, makes it fiercer and more complex.
Exactly.
I want to challenge you, the listener, to look at your own life right now. Look at your career trajectory. Look at your financial portfolio. Look at your daily habits. Have you spent so much energy engineering out the stress, avoiding the friction, and seeking the comfortable middle path that you have accidentally made yourself a candle? Are you waiting for a wind you can't predict to blow you out? What is one small controlled stressor, one heavy weight you could load onto the far end of your barbell that you can voluntarily inject into your life today? How can you restructure your exposure so that when the wind inevitably blows, you become the fire?
Today's material comprises two influential texts, The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile, which explore how highly improbable events shape our world and how systems can actually benefit from chaos, volatility, and disorder. But I want to immediately begin the assessment here, because, well, while the foundational theories are robust, there are significant structural and logical gaps that need to be addressed to strengthen the overall argument.
I completely agree. I mean, it is a huge paradigm shift from trying to prevent shocks to looking at how systems process those shocks. But the construction of the argument definitely needs work.
Yeah, so let's quickly synthesize the core claims. The Black Swan basically argues that history is driven by uncomputable extreme events.
Right.
And it claims that humans suffer from the narrative fallacy and the turkey problem, meaning that predictive models in complex domains are just dangerous illusions.
Exactly. And then Anti-Fragile builds on that by proposing that some systems, like the mythical Hydra, actually gain from disorder.
Which is a wild concept.
Yeah, it introduces things like via negativa, which is addition by subtraction, and it heavily insists on having skin in the game to prevent the transfer of fragility.
So a key theme running through this material seems to be comparing these ideas to a biological immune system, right? Where exposure to pathogens builds strength.
Yes, that's the core analogy.
But here is my pushback. If we apply this biological evolutionary metaphor to complex, engineered socioeconomic systems, is that really a direct one-to-one mapping? Or does it just mask deeper systemic vulnerabilities?
Well, that is the exact tension the author has to navigate. But before we get into the weaknesses, we should objectively highlight the genuine strengths, because some of these insights are truly powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, the concepts of via negativa, just improving by removing the bad, and the barbell strategy, where you pair extreme risk aversion with extreme risk-taking and just completely avoid the middle.
Right. Those are brilliant, actionable mental models. They hold up perfectly in real-world applications, like personal finance and medicine.
Yeah, and the author's identification of the agency problem, the lack of skin in the game in modern institutions, that is a highly potent critique.
Totally. It is incredibly strong on that micro level.
It is, but while those micro-level heuristics are undeniably strong, the macro-level applications reveal some serious methodological cracks. Which brings me to our first major critique.
Let's hear it.
The material's reliance on aggressive rhetoric and cherry-picked historical anecdotes significantly undermines its analytical rigor.
Yeah, it frequently overgeneralizes. I mean, the text constantly dismisses entire fields of academic economics or predictive modeling, calling people fragilistas or turkeys.
Right, and it relies so heavily on post-hoc anecdotal evidence, like pointing to the collapse of Fannie Mae, or using the story of Thales buying olive presses to confirm its theories.
Which creates this huge, unfalsifiable loop. Basically, any system that happens to survive is retroactively labeled anti-fragile, and anything that fails is just fragile.
Exactly. By doing that, the author falls into the exact narrative fallacy that they explicitly condemn in The Black Swan.
So, to fix this, the suggestion is to ground the arguments in balanced, rigorous empirical analysis rather than dismissive anecdotes. The author needs to establish falsifiable criteria for these concepts before events actually occur.
Right. For example, instead of broadly labeling Soviet Harvard academics as fools, specify which exact models of risk, like Gaussian distributions, fail in which specific extremistan environments.
Give us the data.
Yes. Cite systemic statistical data over a 10-year period, comparing decentralized municipalities with centralized states, rather than just relying on the rhetorical tale of Fat Tony versus Socrates.
That's clearly laid out. I wonder, though, if we've considered how stretching those anecdotes creates a clash of logic between the two texts themselves.
Oh, that is a great point. Yeah, let's look at that, because a fundamental friction exists between the absolute unpredictability of extreme events established in the first text and the prescriptive confidence of the second.
Right, because the Black Swan insists on severe epistemic humility. It argues that rare, high-impact events are fundamentally unpredictable, and human systems are just totally blind to them.
But then Anti-Fragile builds a highly deterministic framework. It confidently asserts that you can map the world into a triad of fragile, robust, and antifragile, and safely predict that the antifragile systems will survive.
Exactly. And that subsequent confidence directly conflicts with the strict limits of knowledge advocated earlier.
So how do we improve that?
The suggestion is to reconcile the epistemological limits of the first book with the practical heuristics of the second by explicitly defining the boundaries of what the triad can actually predict.
I like that. So for a concrete example, you could add a clarifying section explaining that the triad is merely a heuristic for exposure, not a guarantee of survival.
Right. For instance, you could explicitly note that while a decentralized system like Switzerland's cantons is structurally anti-fragile to local political noise, it remains completely fragile to a global systemic black swan.
Like a planetary ecological collapse?
Exactly. And by doing that, you preserve the original epistemic humility.
The material makes a strong case for the triad by highlighting local resilience, but exploring how it predicts survival leads us to examine the underlying unstated premises about human behavior and institutional structures.
Which are pretty massive assumptions.
They are. The framework operates on an overly simplified assumption that decentralized risk-taking and individual skin in the game naturally produce optimal outcomes for the collective.
Yeah, it assumes human rationality is best expressed through independent tinkering, and that systems just self-correct perfectly when individuals bear the downside.
But it completely ignores that local, independent risk-taking can collectively result in systemic gridlock or resource depletion. And it assumes large institutions are inherently fragilizing, failing to acknowledge the stabilizing role they often play in preventing total collapse.
That makes sense, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion, like acknowledging the complexities of systemic interdependence?
Yes, that is exactly the suggestion for improvement. The text has to explicitly acknowledge the conditions where decentralized tinkering breaks down.
Give me an example of how they could do that.
Well, they could incorporate an analysis of the tragedy of the commons, demonstrating how individual skin in the game can lead to collective ruin without coordination.
Oh, that's a perfect counterexample.
Right? And contrast this by examining modern aviation. The author praises its safety, but they should explicitly acknowledge that this safety relies heavily on centralized top-down regulations and standardized reporting.
Which is the exact type of bureaucracy the text otherwise derides.
Exactly. Now, because the framework relies so heavily on the survival of the collective system through local tinkering, it entirely misses the human cost of that process, which leads to my next point.
Go for it.
The analysis significantly overlooks the dynamics of social systems, structural inequality, and the necessity of collective action.
Yeah, I noticed that too. The framework focuses entirely on the survival and growth of the system, like evolution or capitalism, through the constant sacrifice of its individual parts.
Like bankrupt entrepreneurs or just, the weak.
Right. It relies on this brutal Darwinian mechanism that creates massive social inequality, which the text largely just dismisses as a natural necessity.
So the suggestion here is to integrate a sociological lens to balance the evolutionary and financial perspectives, accounting for human welfare and structural disparities.
What would be a good concrete example for that?
They could discuss how unequal starting capital alters one's ability to be a rational flunner or to absorb losses in a trial and error process.
Because you need money to just tinker around and fail.
Exactly. And they could explore how a social safety net, which the text currently views as a fragilizing top-down intervention, might actually function as a macroeconomic barbell strategy.
Wait, how so?
By protecting the absolute downside of citizens, preventing starvation, so they can actually afford to take the entrepreneurial risks the author champions.
I can see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this transition from theoretical blind spots to practical realities. Because how a reader might actually implement these frameworks is huge.
It is. How do we separate the highly actionable heuristics of this material from the dangerous misapplications, like when people use the concept of anti-fragility as an intellectual excuse for reckless deregulation?
Right. Because ideas like the personal barbell strategy, chaos engineering in IT, and via negative in medical interventions are highly actionable and invaluable.
But the misapplication is terrifying.
Is there a risk that focusing solely on the benefits of chaos might overlook bad actors?
Definitely. The danger arises when concepts are misapplied by actors who introduce artificial volatility or dismantle necessary protections under the guise of building anti-fragility.
Yeah.
Well, they secretly violate the skin in the game rule by shielding themselves from the downside of the chaos they create.
It's privatization of gains and socialization of losses, dressed up as evolutionary theory.
Exactly. So let's give our final verdict to wrap this up.
Okay, so a balanced conclusion. In terms of what to adopt, the barbell strategy, via negativa, and skin in the game are essential heuristics for personal and organizational risk management.
But what readers should question is the romanticization of the chaotic tinkerer, the absolute dismissal of all top-down expertise, and the friction between the epistemic humility of the black swan and the prescriptive confidence of anti-fragile.
And what to completely discard? The aggressive ad hominem rhetoric, the reliance on post hoc anecdotal proofs, and the assumption that systemic anti-fragility justifies the brutal destruction of the individual.
Right. So just to summarize the actionable suggestions for the author. First, ground the arguments in falsifiable empirical data. Second, explicitly define the predictive limits of the triad.
Third, address the interdependent risks of the tragedy of the commons. And finally, reframe social safety nets as systemic barbell strategies rather than fragilizers.
That would make this submission incredibly strong.
It really would. Thank you to the listener for submitting these deeply thought-provoking texts. Please refine the material based on this critique and submit it back for further review.
Welcome to the debate. When an engineer sits down to build a bridge, the entire goal is resistance. You calculate the maximum load, you estimate the highest wind speed, you factor in the worst possible earthquake, and then you just build the steel and concrete to withstand exactly that expected stress.
Right. It's entirely about surviving anticipated disorder. I mean, it's an exercise in robustness. You just want the bridge to stay exactly the way it is.
Exactly. But then, look at a biological system. Look at a human bone or muscle. If you put a bone in a zero-gravity vacuum, perfectly safe from all stress, it doesn't stay perfectly intact.
It atrophies.
It decays. Yeah, it actually requires microfractures, the shock of the pavement, the physical stress, just to grow denser and stronger.
So the bridge demands tranquility, but the bone is actually, starved without disorder.
Right. And that distinction is basically the foundation of our discussion today. We are engaging in an analytical, rigorous critique of two seminal books by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile.
Two very dense, very provocative books.
Very much so. And the core thesis of The Black Swan is that history and socioeconomic life are completely dominated by highly improbable, unpredictable, and just massively consequential rare events. And because of these extreme outliers, our standard predictive models they're basically useless.
And then Anti-Fragile builds on that diagnosis with a prescription.
Right. Taleb claims that since we absolutely cannot predict these extreme shocks, our systems shouldn't just be built to survive disorder. They should actively gain from shocks, volatility, and stress. They should move beyond mere robustness into what he coined as anti-fragility. Which brings us to the core disagreement we're exploring today. Do Taleb's frameworks actually provide a genuinely actionable, mathematically grounded blueprint for decision-making under severe uncertainty?
That is the big question.
And I take the position that these concepts are mathematically rigorous, empirically true, and practically necessary for our survival in an increasingly complex world.
And I will argue that while the underlying math has merit, the framework as a whole is structurally inconsistent. I mean, it relies heavily on the exact narrative fallacies it critiques and contains some severe social blind spots when applied to human systems.
Let's start with the foundational strengths then. Because if we're going to evaluate this fairly, I think it's vital to strip away Taleb's rhetorical bluster, of which there is a lot, and look at the mechanical truths underneath.
Fair enough.
For me, the most powerful insight here is the mathematical reality of asymmetry, specifically the concept of convexity versus concavity.
We should probably define that clearly because convexity is a term that gets thrown around a lot in financial circles, but rarely explained in plain English.
Yeah, good point. For those who haven't mapped the math lately, what does it mean to actually be convex to a mistake or a random event? Essentially, convexity means you have nonlinear, disproportionate payoffs.
Meaning the upside is bigger than the downside?
Exactly. The curve of your potential upside grows much steeper than the curve of your potential downside. So if the absolute worst thing that can happen is I lose $100, but the best thing that can happen is I make $10,000, my position is convex.
Right.
Taleb isn't just making a philosophical point about liking chaos, you know? He's pointing out that certain systems mathematically have more upside than downside from volatility. If I have a strictly capped downside and an open-ended upside, I actually want the world to be volatile. I am anti-fragile.
I agree that the underlying mathematics of convexity are sound. The math is the math. Where I come at it from a different way is how he applies it. The structural weaknesses emerge when Taleb overgeneralizes and exaggerates these mathematical properties into a grand universal theory of everything.
Overgeneralizes? Where do you see the overgeneralization?
Well, my primary critique is his overwhelming reliance on cherry-picked anecdotal evidence to prove structural points. I mean, there is a profound irony here. Taleb vehemently attacks the narrative fallacy.
Right. The human tendency to tell story.
Exactly. This human tendency to fool ourselves with neat post hoc stories that impose causality on completely random events. He tells us that history is opaque and historians are essentially writing fiction by connecting random dots. Yet, to prove his own points, what does he do? He heavily relies on selective historical anecdotes.
You're talking about his historical avatars.
Yes, he gives us Thales of Miletus getting rich on olive presses to prove the value of optionality. He uses Seneca the Stoic to prove emotional robustness. He even creates his own fictional character, Fat Tony, to represent, like, street-smart anti-fragility against the naive intellectual.
Sure, but
He is using the exact narrative tools, the exact storytelling fallacies that he actively disparages in his critics.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I don't think he's using Fat Tony or Thales as empirical proof. He's using them as phenomenological illustrations of a mathematical reality.
Illustrations?
Yes, he's putting a face on the math so the reader can digest it. It's pedagogy, not data.
But when you rely on parables instead of rigorous systemic boundary conditions, you invite massive logical gaps. The biggest one being his translation from biology to society. He assumes that what applies to a biological organism like muscles growing from stress via Wolff's Law, or, the phenomenon of hormesis, where a small dose of poison makes you stronger, seamlessly translates to complex, interconnected socioeconomic systems.
You think that's a leap?
That is a massive, unproven leap. You can't just map a bicep onto the global supply chain.
Well, let's test that leap, though. Let's look at how these ideas actually connect, moving from his diagnosis of the world to his prescription. Because if we are mapping this out, the black swan is the diagnosis. The world is dominated by the fourth quadrant.
Or extremistan, as he calls it.
Right, extremistan. For clarity, extremistan is a domain where a single observation can disproportionately impact the total. If you take 1,000 random people and add their weight together, the heaviest person won't meaningfully change the total. That's mediocristan.
Right, the physical world.
But if you take 1,000 random people and add their wealth together, and one of them is Elon Musk, that one outlier represents 99.9% of the total. That's extremistan. And Taleb argues that modern socioeconomic life, markets, pandemics, internet trends, wars all live in extremistan.
The risks are incomputable.
Completely incomputable.
Which is a brilliant and largely accurate diagnosis of modern complexity. I don't dispute the existence of the fourth quadrant.
Okay, so if we accept that diagnosis, that we are mathematically barred from predicting catastrophic tail risks in extremistan, then anti-fragile is the only logical cure. We have to build systems that survive what we cannot predict.
Okay.
And this brings us to the barbell strategy, which I think perfectly synthesizes his entire framework.
The barbell strategy being the idea of avoiding the middle ground entirely.
Exactly. You play it extremely safe on one end and extremely speculative on the other. You keep, say, 90% of your assets or your systemic exposure in hyper-conservative, maximally safe instruments. Cash, treasury bills, whatever won't blow up.
Right.
Then you take the remaining 10% and put it in highly speculative, convex bets. Out-of-the-money options, angel investments, wild startups. You completely avoid the murky middle of medium-risk investments.
Because the middle is where the hidden risk lies.
Yes. By doing this, you marry the deep paranoia of the black swan with the aggressive upside seeking of anti-fragile. You clip your incomputable risk on the downside, but leave yourself open to positive black swans.
That is a compelling setup, but have you considered the glaring internal contradiction within that very strategy? It's a tension between his two books that never truly gets resolved.
What tension? The barbell is the direct answer to the black swan.
But it relies on an assumption that contradicts the black swan. If the black swan teaches us anything, it is that the world of extremistan is defined by hidden, invisible risks that our models cannot capture. The future is opaque.
Right.
If the world is truly that opaque, how can anyone ever confidently identify the hyper-conservative 90%?
Well, because you choose assets with zero historical volatility.
But that's exactly the trap he warns against. You say, put it in maximally safe instruments. Well, in 2007, AA-rated mortgage-backed securities were considered the safest instruments on the planet. People treated them like cash.
That was a model error, though.
Exactly. U.S. Treasury bills are considered safe today until a sovereign debt crisis, a political default, or hyperinflation suddenly proves they aren't. My point is, the barbell strategy implicitly requires a level of predictive certainty about what is definitively safe that the black swan explicitly insists we cannot possess. It smuggles prediction right back through the back door.
Wait, I think you're conflating perceived institutional safety with structural safety. Taleb is very clear about the difference, and he explains it through the turkey problem.
The turkey that gets fed for 1,000 days.
Yes, the turkey thinks the butcher is its best friend because it has 1,000 days of statistical data showing a daily feeding. The risk model looks incredibly safe, right up until the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, when the turkey experiences a catastrophic black swan event.
Right.
AA ratings are turkey safety. They rely on the naive assumption that the absence of past volatility equals future safety. But structural safety, in Taleb's framework, doesn't rely on institutional models. It relies on things like physical cash, gold, or decentralized assets that do not have complex cascading counterparty risks.
Even physical cash isn't safe from hyperinflation, which is an extremistan event. I mean, you're still making a prediction that the state backing that cash will survive.
But you are massively reducing your exposure to the cascading failures of interconnected systems. You are stepping out of the casino. But this actually transitions us perfectly to the human element. Because if we're going to execute these strategies, whether it's building a barbell or avoiding the turkey problem, we have to look at the individuals making the decisions. Taleb's entire framework rests on a specific assumption about human behavior and risk.
You're talking about skin in the game.
Yes. This is his solution to the agency problem. Taleb argues that systems only function rationally when decision makers bear the downside of their actions.
Right.
The reason our institutions are so fragile is because bankers, bureaucrats, and what he calls fragilistas socialize their losses and privatize their gains. Think of the 2008 banker. They get the upside of the volatility in the form of massive bonuses, but when the systemic black swan hits, the taxpayer gets the downside.
The bailout.
Exactly. When you force decision makers to have skin in the game, to face personal ruin for their bad models, the system naturally corrects itself. It's a highly realistic mechanical understanding of institutional behavior.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Skin in the game is a great heuristic for aligning corporate incentives, absolutely. But Taleb hides a massive assumption inside it. He assumes that relentless localized trial and error, what he calls tinkering, is universally superior to top-down design.
And you disagree with that?
Well, he bases this on the idea that perpetual financial precariousness creates a stronger individual. Look at his famous analogy of the taxi driver versus the bank clerk.
Ah, yes.
He romanticizes the taxi driver. He argues the bank clerk is fragile because a single HR decision, a single firing, ruins their entire income stream. Meanwhile, the taxi driver experiences daily income volatility. Some days are great, some days are terrible. And therefore, the taxi driver is anti-fragile because they are constantly adapting to the stress.
The taxi driver has distributed risk. They don't have a single point of failure. I mean, that's a mechanical truth.
But if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, that sounds great in a vacuum, but what about the realities of living on the edge? Taleb's assumption is that all stressors are hormetic, that they are the small doses of poison that make you stronger.
Right.
But for a modern gig worker or a taxi driver, a broken transmission or a sudden medical emergency isn't a positive stressor that forces them to innovate. It's a ruinous event that bankrupts them. Taleb's framework is heavily biased toward a specific, highly privileged type of risk-taking, where the baseline of survival is already secured. He assumes the taxi driver can just bounce back from a bad month, ignoring the actual mechanics of poverty traps.
I share that, but you're injecting a moral judgment into a mechanical observation. Taleb isn't saying the taxi driver's life is easier, more pleasant, or more fair. He is observing the mathematical distribution of their risk.
But it matters.
The bank clerk really does have a hidden extremistan risk. 1,000 days of steady paychecks and then zero. The turkey problem. The taxi driver lives in mediocrestan. Their bad days are capped. But let's take your critique and scale it up. Let's expand from the individual to society at large, because I know you have concerns about how this applies to collective action.
I absolutely do, and it links directly back to that biological metaphor we discussed at the start. You said the bone needs stress to grow. In biology, evolution itself is the ultimate anti-fragile system. The species gets stronger through shocks, predators, and environmental volatility.
Right.
But we have to ask how evolution achieves this. It achieves it through the brutal, unforgiving death of the unfit individuals.
The macro system is anti-fragile because the micro components are fragile.
Exactly. And that is the massive social blind spot. As critics like David Runciman have pointed out, anti-fragility can be inherently antisocial when applied to human economies. The fragility of the failing entrepreneur, the bankrupt family, the evicted tenant, the brutal breaking of these micro-components might make the overall capitalist economy anti-fragile, but it completely ignores the human cost.
But
Taleb's framework demands constant volatility. But where do psychology, social safety nets, and systemic inequality fit into this? A framework that relies on the constant breaking of its parts to strengthen the whole is a terrifying blueprint for a society.
that is a very emotionally resonant argument. But let's rigorously examine the consequences of your alternative. You are arguing for protecting the microcomponents from volatility. Taleb explicitly addresses this. He calls it the Soviet Harvard delusion.
Oh, the idea that intellectual elites can manage away all risk?
Right. When you try to protect people from all volatility, you do not actually eliminate the risk. That's the mechanical reality you're missing here. You merely suppress the risk, forcing it to accumulate invisibly under the surface of the system.
Like suppressing a symptom without curing the disease.
Let's look at forestry. If you suppress every single small, natural forest fire to protect the individual trees, the dead wood accumulates on the forest floor. You think you've created safety, but you've actually built a bomb. Eventually, a spark catches and you get a catastrophic, uncontainable superfire that destroys everything, including the soil.
So economic interventions are the suppression of small fires?
Exactly. If the government constantly props up failing businesses to save jobs, you create zombie banks. You build an economy of deadwood. By trying to build a social safety net that removes all economic stress, you are building the ultimate turkey problem at a national scale. Artificial stability leads to massive, unexpected slaughter.
I see the logic, but
Taleb argues, and the math supports this, that it is vastly more ethical to allow small, localized failures and bankruptcies than to engineer a systemic collapse that destroys the entire currency. Because when the superfire happens, it invariably hurts the poorest and most vulnerable, far worse than the localized volatility ever would.
But you're presenting a false dichotomy between artificial perfect stability on one hand and hyper-volatile Darwinian tinkering on the other. I mean, there is a middle ground, that very murky middle he tells us to avoid, where institutions actually pool risk to protect citizens without inevitably causing systemic collapse.
Give me an example where top-down planning doesn't accumulate hidden risk.
Top-down planning eradicated smallpox. Top-down, centralized planning built the interstate highway system. Random tinkering and decentralized skin in the game will not solve collective action problems like a global pandemic or planetary pollution.
Well,
You can't via negativa your way out of a depleted ozone layer. Taleb's dismissal of predictive science and centralized planning is dangerously fatalistic. When dealing with global existential threats, we cannot afford to just tinker and let the system learn from catastrophic shocks. We have to predict and we have to plan.
wait, let me stop you there, because I think you're mischaracterizing his stance on science. He doesn't dismiss all predictive science. He is incredibly precise about domains. He dismisses predictive models in extremistan, in complex, highly interconnected socioeconomic systems.
So biology is exempt?
Predicting the trajectory of a comet or the replication rate of a virus in a lab is physics and hard biology. We can do that. But predicting the stock market or forecasting the geopolitical outcome of a 10-year foreign intervention, that is hubris.
But the lines between those domains are often blurred. I mean, public health is both hard biology and socioeconomic behavior.
Which is why we need to talk about real-world usefulness. Are his insights actually actionable, or are they just intellectually appealing paradoxes? I argue they are deeply universally actionable, precisely because they don't require you to be a psychic.
How so?
Take the ludic fallacy. This is the concept that real life doesn't have the clear, bounded rules of a casino game. In a casino, the odds are known. In life, the biggest risks are things you literally cannot conceive of.
The true black swans.
Right. Once you internalize the ludic fallacy, you stop trying to calculate exact probabilities for real-world risks. Instead, you focus on via negativa, addition by subtraction.
Improving the system by removing vulnerabilities rather than adding features.
Yes. You look at your life, your business, your supply chain, and you ask, where are my single points of failure? You remove debt. You remove an over-reliance on a single supplier in a foreign country. In medicine, it means avoiding iogenetics, harm caused by the healer, by refusing unnecessary interventions for minor ailments.
Okay, I see the practicality there.
You don't need to predict exactly what the next global crisis will be to know that a heavily indebted company will be punished by it. Focusing on fragility rather than prediction is profoundly practical.
It is practical on an individual level, I will concede that. But culturally and politically, it is highly susceptible to misapplication. Anti-fragility has frequently been co-opted as an intellectual excuse for recklessness and deregulation.
Wait, how is removing debt reckless?
It's not the debt removal, it's the romanticization of disorder. It becomes a sophisticated-sounding justification for Silicon Valley's move fast and break things ethos, or a hardcore libertarian argument against any market regulation.
I think that's a stretch.
No, think about it. If we view all regulation as fragilizing the system, we invite predators. Taleb correctly identifies that complex systems are opaque, but his prescription to simply embrace the disorder allows actors with outsized power to exploit that disorder at the expense of others.
That's not what he's advocating, though.
Even if Taleb explicitly condemns the fragilistas who transfer risk, his poetic praise of chaos provides the exact philosophical cover those powerful actors use to dismantle worker protections and safety regulations.
But that is a deliberate misreading of his ethics. His entire concept of skin in the game is dedicated to the ethical rule that thou shalt not have anti-fragility at the expense of the fragility of others. If a massive tech monopoly or a Wall Street firm is using his concepts to justify socializing their risks, they aren't practicing his framework. They are violating its core axiom.
What's that? The framework allows for that misreading because of its fundamental reliance on ambiguity and narrative styling. When you write books filled with aggressive polemics, mocking clerks, and praising street-smart operators, instead of laying down rigorous systemic boundary conditions, you invite misinterpretation. You can't write a manifesto praising volatility and then act shocked when volatile actors use it to break things.
Well, let's pull this all together and move toward our final verdicts. Having unpacked the mechanics, the tensions between the books, and the systemic blind spots, how do we synthesize this material? From my perspective, there are elements of this framework that absolutely must be adopted by any serious thinker, investor, or practitioner.
What's at the top of your adopt list?
First, we must adopt the healthy, rigorous skepticism of predictive models when operating in extremistan. The historical record of economic and geopolitical forecasting is empirically abysmal, and Taleb's mathematical explanation of fat tails shows us exactly why.
Agreed.
Second, we must adopt the ethical and structural necessity of enforcing skin in the game. If decision makers do not bear the downside of their choices, institutional collapse is a mathematical guarantee. And finally, the barbell strategy, the practice of capping your downside risk entirely while remaining open to serendipitous positive black swans, is a vital heuristic for navigating a world we cannot fully understand.
I completely agree with his diagnosis of the limits of prediction. But here is what I believe must be heavily questioned and, in many cases, discarded. We must question the romanticization of disorder. The over-application of biological models to human society is dangerous. I mean, a society is not a muscle, and treating it like one ignores the very real human suffering that occurs during periods of severe economic volatility.
And what do we discard?
We should discard the absolute dogmatic dismissal of all top-down planning. While naive interventionism certainly exists, collective coordination is the only way we solve existential threats that cannot be addressed by millions of disconnected people randomly tinkering. And fundamentally, we must recognize the structural hypocrisy of relying on cherry-picked historical anecdotes to prove a theory about the absolute danger of narrative fallacies.
It seems the tension remains unresolved. We are caught between recognizing the fundamental mathematical unpredictability of our complex world and the imperative to build a society that protects its vulnerable citizens from the brutality of that randomness.
Exactly. Taleb wants us to stop fighting the wind and instead become the fire that uses the wind. It's a beautiful thought. But we always have to ask, who is being used as the kindling?
The real value here lies in looking at these texts analytically. If you apply a bit of your own via negativa to the text itself, subtracting the author's ego, the rhetorical attacks, and the parables, you find incredibly powerful mathematical and mechanical truths underneath. There is so much more to explore in this material regarding how we make decisions under severe opacity.
Indeed. There is a rich vein of insight to be mined if you read it with your eyes wide open to its contradictions.
We'll leave it to you, the listener, to form your own final verdict. But the next time you look at a system, whether it's your own career trajectory, a global supply chain, or that bridge we mentioned at the start, ask yourself, is it just sitting there waiting for the one massive storm it wasn't designed to withstand? Or could it somehow learn to thrive in the wind?